Okay, welcome. Welcome to our opening session of our 16th annual forum, 16 years of doing these wonderful events. We're delighted to have you join us for a day of inspiring conversations. Our forum is a culmination of a thought leadership series we started in January that has been dedicated to issues at the intersection of equity and education to employment. Today, we have 3 sessions planned. Our 11 o'clock session will be followed by sessions at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock that both explore revolutionary change in high schools. I also urge you to join us tomorrow at 1 o'clock for a powerful session when 4 outstanding women leaders from Bank of America, Northern Trust, Panasonic Foundation, and Prudential explore the role of corporations and foundations in narrowing the equity gap. This session that I am proud to introduce is our kickoff forum session. Its topic came about because Schools That Can is very engaged, and I'm very proud of that, in Pittsburgh. Because of our work here, we of course have been influenced by the magic of Mr. Rogers. So when Gregg Behr's book that provides a unique look at Mr. Rogers was recently published, we felt this was the time to consider what Mr. Rogers means to us all and to our future. With so much chaos in the world, it seems a timely moment to reflect on and consider how Mr. Rogers can impact our lives. The title of this session is Looking to Our Future with a Familiar Neighbor, Fred Rogers. We are so fortunate to be joined by 3 awesome Fred Rogers cheerleaders, all who have been deeply influenced in their outstanding work by the magic of Fred Rogers, Jane Werner, Gregg Behr, and Junlei. This session is meant to be an intimate conversation between friends, and therefore there is no formal moderator. It is with great pleasure to welcome these remarkable conversationalists who we are honored to have kicking off this year's annual forum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. And it's such a pleasure, Greg and Jane, to be meeting here. I hope we get to meet in person back in Pittsburgh soon. It's a pleasure because we have been colleagues and friends for years, and when we all share many things, but in particular, kind of a connection to the work of Fred Rogers and our own work about supporting children and families, not just in Pittsburgh, but across many communities. So I just wanted to start to give both of you a chance to introduce yourself. Greg, you're the executive director of the Grebel Foundation. And so as a foundation leader, I just wanted our audience to understand kind of the role you and the foundation play in supporting children's learning and development, and in particular, kind of this Remake Learning movement that you have helped to lead and start and coordinate, over the last decade.
Thank you, Junlei. And thank you also to Michael and Schools That Can. It's a complete joy to be with you and Jane, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So hi, everyone. I'm Gregg Behr. I'm joining you from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. And for now 15 years, I've had the privilege of serving as executive director for the Grebel Foundation. So the Grebel Foundation is a private charitable foundation dedicated to supporting the lives of children and youth, their educators, and their families. And with a focus on kids who, for economic reasons, don't have the same opportunities as their peers. So we have the opportunity in our region to support extraordinary people and organizations like the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh and the work that Jane and her colleagues do, among others. And so our grant-making focus, Junlei, runs from early childhood through those post-secondary years in and out of school. And you mentioned Remake Learning. So the work of Remake Learning almost coincides with my tenure at the Grebel Foundation. And the simple origin story is this. Let me take you back to late 2006, early 2007. I had come into this position and had the opportunity to meet with teachers, librarians, and also youth workers and just extraordinary leaders, again, like Jane, and ask the question, what is it that we can do that would be most helpful? What would be most helpful as we support kids, as we support educators, as we support great learning in and out of school? And Junlei, there was something that I didn't notice at first that then became apparent in these conversations. And it was this, that the adults with whom I was speaking, the grown-ups, were saying, I'm not connecting with kids with the way that I used to. Now, at first, I didn't think anything of it. It just sounded like, oh, kids these days, right? Like, I'm probably guilty of doing that now myself, right? But when I began to notice, what I noticed is that the people who were saying it were of themselves of different ages, of different years of experience in working with children and youth. And they literally meant my classroom in 2005 versus 2006, which once I began to notice that provokes a question like, well, that's weird, what's going on? And again, it feels naive in 2021 to say this, but in late 2006, I wasn't deeply familiar with the work of the learning sciences. And the things coming out of universities like Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh right here in my own backyard, and really appreciating that something seismic was happening in kids' lives, that they were developing their identities differently, that they were seeking affirmation differently, that they were consuming and producing information differently. And once we began to notice that, the question was this: are we investing in kids and their futures in the right ways? As we think about supporting schools and museums and libraries, do we need to think differently about pedagogical approach, about the design of spaces, about the design of experiences? And that's when the work together with folks like Jane started in what was originally called Kids in Creativity and now is called Remake Learning. Fast forward 15 years, Remake Learning is a regional learning network, what some people would call a learning ecosystem, of more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers that are advancing relevant, engaging, and equitable learning. And as we'll talk this morning, there are some unexpected ties in that work to the core work of Fred Rogers.
Thank you, Greg. I mean, as you recap that so briefly, I remember, kind of sitting with you when you first came to Grebel Foundation, just in the very beginning, talking about some of these ideas, and the first kind of network meeting that we had when, all these people in the community who are working on children's issues, but who haven't really had a chance to connect in a deep way. And it's just tremendous kind of how much have changed. I wanted to come back to some of the points you mentioned about, the way educators think about kind of how we can adapt and then what does it mean to connect with children. But before that, as you're talking about rethinking spaces, rethinking experiences, Jane, you're the executive director of the renowned and award-winning kind of Pittsburgh Children's Museum. And I wanted to mention specifically that as your team think about exhibits and experiences, it's not just what's in the museum. You've taken it out to neighborhoods, to schools. So I love to, just for you and for the audience to understand kind of how do you envision, right, the work of a children's museum support the learning and development of children, not just those who come to the museum, but all across the community?
Yeah, so it's kind of fun to hear Greg tell the origin story. The part of it that he doesn't mention is that he actually bought us all breakfast. That's how we actually started. Anybody who invites you to breakfast, go. So food always plays an important role, I think, when you're brainstorming about the future and doing big ideas. And Greg had a really big vision, and we all just knew it immediately. So it's just, his work has been so interesting to watch. And we loved being part of it. It's kind of interesting, the Children's Museum has it's had kind of an interesting history, right? I mean, we started very small. We started in the basement of an old post office building in the 80s, and we kind of kept expanding. And I became director in '99 and really expanded the museum at that point in 2004. We did a major $80,000 renovation. But what's kind of interesting, I was thinking about how Fred kind of influenced us too. It went from being kind of a museum experience only, where you could bring your kids and it was, it was fun, and you had a moment where families could kind of fall in love with their kids all over again and fall in love with their capabilities, and look at just what it was like, just kind of trying to remember what your own childhood was like. at the museum. And then we kind of started to do more and more. We saw 320,000 people in the museum. And what I started to become interested in, and I think what the team here has become interested in, is what is the role of the museum in kind of this learning landscape? And the work around Remake Learning has really kind of pushed us forward even more so in that. By developing a learning and research department, we are able to actually look and measure the kind of learning that happens in the informal learning world. We do have 2 Head Start pre-K programs at the Pittsburgh Public Schools in the building, and they come every day. So, we see those kids, we get to know those families. Of course, this is all pre-COVID. We're just now getting the kids back in the building. And that has been, we've had the kids here since 2004. So what is that? It's a long time. I don't even want to think about how long it is. But a couple of years ago, actually, in 2019, we decided to take it to scale even further, and we opened Museum Lab. And Museum Lab is all about looking at the intersection of the informal world with the formal classroom and trying to kind of create conversations between both of those, because the informal world is different. How kids learn in our world is different than how they, it's just different. And it occurred to me that museums can actually do the experiments that formal classrooms can't. Like no one ever fails a museum. So we can experiment and then work with our partners like the University of Pittsburgh to really study how kids learn and what works in each one of these environments. And we had some success with our makerspace. We actually prototyped a makerspace here. We did the studies, came up with principles of practice, and then we were able, with partnerships with Google and Kickstarter and Maker Education Initiative, to put over 350 maker spaces in schools across the US and do the professional development. So it's that kind of thing that we're really interested in. And one of the through lines from Fred is that we're now really thinking about social emotional learning and thinking about how do you actually think about social emotional learning in informal settings as well as formal classrooms. And are there experiments that we can do in Museum Lab that actually might impact education in kind of the same way that our maker spaces have done the same thing. So that's kind of what we're up to these days.
Junlei,
go ahead.
In the spirit of conversation, may I underline 2 things that Jane said. So one, she used this phrase, learning landscape, right? And it's Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It wasn't Mr. Rogers' classroom. It wasn't Mr. Rogers' home. It was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So that idea of a learning landscape I think, needs to challenge each of us as a grown-up, if we're an educator or an ally to educators. How do we really think about our regions, our cities, our rural valleys, whatever the landscape is, as a genuine campus for learning for our kids and their families? That's part of the challenge of networking and connecting places like museums and libraries and schools, such that the people who work in those places really come to fundamentally know each other. And then a second thing that Jane said is about experimentation, right? And we're not talking about like wild, crazy, like that's inappropriate. We're talking about developmentally appropriate things, but just different spaces allow for different types of approaches to learning, right? So if we can connect a museum exhibitor to an artist, to a classroom teacher, to a roboticist, right? I mean, the things that we can do to start to really push the bounds of what's possible when we think about learning is so critically important. So we have a colleague that we all know well, Melissa Butler, who has reminded me so much that innovation is about finding something new in something familiar. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a learning network, the learning landscape, allows us all to find new things in things that are familiar that what we do. And I just wanted to underline those brilliant things that Jane had said.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Greg. Brilliant things. I think we just have talked about this in the past, and we probably are playing off of each other.
That's right. I think part of kind of thinking of learning as a landscape is the possibility for learning and development happens across that landscape, right? Whether you're in the rural corners of southwestern PA or the urban centers, whether you're in the museums, or even in the parking lot that connects Jane, your museum, with the Pittsburgh Public School where Melissa Butler was in. And I just, it reminded me particularly, I think, in both of your talks, how intentional you have been, whether it's through funding, building a network of people, or designing exhibits and experiences, that how intentional you both have been, not just invest and design stuff, but to intentionally support the connections that happens around stuff and spaces so that people can connect, not just children with families, families with educators, but even amongst educators that they can connect. And ultimately it's these connections, right, throughout the neighborhood that make it work.
Yes.
So I wanted to, we mentioned this a couple of times. I know within the last few years, there has been kind of this resurgence of interest in the work of Fred Rogers. His program, started in 1968. And there's been a documentary a few years ago, and then, of course, the best-selling biography, and then the Hollywood movie with Tom Hanks. And Gregg, of course, you have your book just coming out, which we'll get to in just a bit. But I wonder, just from both of your perspective, part of this resurgence is nostalgic, because people grew up with the neighborhood. But I think a huge part of this is looking forward. Because there are connections between the legacy and the work that Fred represented and the work we actually have to do today and tomorrow. I would love to hear from both of you kind of what you saw as the connection, the relevance for the important work that we have going ahead, particularly in supporting children and supporting students, teachers, and families.
Jane, do you want to go first?
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's interesting. I was reflecting back on like how I met Fred and how I worked with Fred and what the exhibits we worked on together were like and how that has changed over time. So my first exhibit, I was actually an exhibit and program director, was working with Fred on Welcome to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And that was in the 90s. And so it was actually Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. You walked into his front door, you tried on a sweater, you sat on the swing. It was actually kind of, based on the show. And then the next thing we did with Fred was how people make things based on picture. So again, kind of real, tangible things. But now we're working on things. The next exhibit we did was Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. And it was all about social emotional things that are wrapped up in Daniel's world. And it was different than how people make things, and it was different than Welcome to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And now we're just starting to talk about Don Quixote, doing an exhibit with them, which is all going to be about persistence. So it's kind of this interesting thing that has happened even in our direct work with the Fred Rogers Company. We're seeing that kids need different things than they necessarily, I shouldn't say that. Maybe we're just thinking about what exhibits can do. And I think that throughout my career, the other thing I've started to learn, and this is probably directly from Fred, is that we've stopped spending money on stuff. We started to spend money on people, because the interactions with people are where these really interesting learnings happen. So our makerspace and our studio are prime examples of that. It's the conversations between our staff and the visitor that we find, I think our learning scientists are finding to be the most interesting. So it's a mind shift for the museum, which I think is, again, a direct link to Fred, because in a lot of ways, Fred's messages were all about the people. And in fact, there's there's a reason it's called How People Make Things. He was very, very deliberate about the title of that exhibit. It's an interesting, it's interesting how that, even the work that was in 1968 still impacts us in a really direct way. So that's what I would say.
I share the joy of having gotten to meet and talked with Fred Rogers. I did not work with him the way that Jane did, and so I'm so glad to, I want to hear more about that, Jane, right? But I think you're right, Junlei, right? There is when we think about the cultural resurgence of Fred Rogers, it's in part the emotional tie, because so many of us grew up over many decades watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and for each of us, it's a familiar, comfortable, warm place to which to return and about which to think. And that's powerful, and especially through difficult times as we're working to bring ourselves and our kids and our families through these difficult times. It's also the case when I think about the two of you and the work that you've done, and the work of the Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent College, the work of Fred Rogers Productions, that after Fred Rogers' death, that work developed and continued apace, right? So the day in, day out work of advancing that legacy forward has been really powerful. And we should acknowledge, being situated in Pittsburgh, there's a memorial right at the confluence of our three rivers in downtown Pittsburgh, a memorial with a statue of Fred Rogers. And it's a tribute to children. And it's this constant reminder in our waters to be mindful about putting kids first. And it's in part, Junlei, then why, as we've thought about remaking learning, or the work that Jane has done with exhibits like How People Build Things, that Fred legacy is part of who we are here in Southwestern Pennsylvania. He was our neighbor. And it's amazing as you go around town and talk to people, how many people have actual stories of, I talked to Mr. Rogers in the bakery. He was one of us, right? So he was our actual neighbor. And it turns out he was exactly who you wanted him to be. And so it's even more pronounced here in Southwestern Pennsylvania, where he lived and where his work originated. And so when we talk about Remake Learning, 15 years ago, we started talking about what we now call the Fred method. I'm not sure we use this language exactly this way, but we very early on started talking about this sense.
I think you coined that, actually. I think you coined that.
Wow, that might be good. but the idea, right? Like, of Fred as someone who was steeped in whole child development theory and practice. Of course, he didn't use those words, but I'm quite sure that people like Margaret McFarland or other people in Pittsburgh like Benjamin Spock and Eric Erickson, some giants of child development theory and practice, he was steeped in that work. But then the other obvious thing for us now, Junlei, is also seeing Fred as a learning scientist. And that's been my own personal aha, right? So really connecting whole child with what we're learning about learning itself. And the best educators among us in high schools and early learning centers and museums and libraries across the country are doing exactly that, which is why this legacy of Fred Rogers and the blueprints that he created for us 50 years ago are so powerful for us right now in 2021 and as we look ahead. Because yes, we want spaces like the museum lab or our classrooms to be spaces that spark curiosity and creativity and communication and collaboration. And we need those to be spaces that are grounded in love, where kids feel like they belong, where their questions are acknowledged, where there are all sorts of caring relationships, the way that you talk powerfully, Junlei, in your own work and your research about the active role of people and relationships. If we can connect that whole child with learning science, we have a real runway to figure out the work that we need to do for our kids as we emerge from this pandemic and the work that's ahead of us in all of our learning sites and our learning landscapes all across this country. And that's why Fred is so important to us now. And I think it's part two for the resurgence of his work.
Yeah, but it's also not just, learning environments are everywhere too. Junlei, you should talk about similar interactions, because that's just being a parent too, being a caring adult. Just recognizing the learning environments are actually everywhere. We just have to pay attention to our kids. Okay, so I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about, because I think simple interactions, again, is brilliant.
Jane, I'm glad you flipped the table because there's a brilliance in our moderator. So
right, I'm always in awe of both of you. So just go ahead, Junlei, please.
Well, I think this is interesting. So I came to Pittsburgh to study learning sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. And unlike both of you, Jane, you worked with Fred, and Greg, you grew up, with the program. I grew up in China, so I had no idea who Fred was. And but I had this really interesting experience of being a graduate student, right? Taking classes about the learning sciences, but then some of the mornings, like before I go to the classroom, I'd have PBS on, and I'll watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but as a full-grown adult. And then for a while, I had trouble connecting the two, right? There was something so appealing about how Fred talked about, children and children's development. And then there's kind of the, I would say, relatively narrow way, right? We were looking at learning and development, in the psychology department. And I knew the two things ought to connect in the way that Greg was just talking about, but they weren't. But I think one of the so kind of powerful and inspiring and ever-giving thing, right, about thinking about Fred's approach or Fred method is that it's not a method that's coined, in 1968 or 80s or whatever. It's this thing that we can continue to develop. I know both of you used the word reminder. It's one of my favorite words about thinking about Fred's work. It's not like Fred, in 1960 told us, like, you must do education like this, But he offers these powerful reminders. So Jane, you talked about how, part of a mindset shift, even from your work, is thinking about let's invest in people, right? In the people experiences and not just in stuff. And then, Fred would have these reminders for all of us that, we all learn and grow best through relationships. He would say that years ago, so his whole program was about how children and viewers and even the puppets, right, learn and grow best from the relationships they have all across the neighborhood. And then, Greg, I think when you talked about the learning landscape, but when you invested in the work of bringing like all the people and organizations in the southwestern PA region who touch upon children, right? It really reminded me of, one of these important reminders coming from Fred about, he would say that each and every one of us longs to know there's something about us worth giving. And I know it seemed, so philosophical and idealistic, but if you think about, every specific context and everyone who touches upon the life of children, you go, what does it mean if we believe that they want to have something worth giving to children, right? So that leads to, the work of the Simple Interactions work, which kind of grew up in Pittsburgh as well. I know you mentioned my colleague, Dr. Dana Winters at the Fred Rogers Center. Of all the Simple Interactions projects that she has led, my favorite one is right on the street corners in Pittsburgh. We worked with other organizations that we connected with through the Remake Learning Network, the mentoring partnership, as well as, and then they were talking about who are the everyday mentors in neighborhoods. And one of those people are the crossing guards on the street corners, like all over Pittsburgh. So our friend Dana, went onto the street corners to follow the crossing guards around with a camera, and was able to find what is so beautiful and worth giving in just 5 to 10 seconds of interaction as a crossing guard kind of accompanies school children on their way to work and on their way back to work. I mean, the crossing guard will notice things, not just, say hello, but like, do you have the right coat? You got new glasses today? Hey, tell your mom this. And then, hey, how'd you do in the school election? Like, the crossing guard on that street corner is this massive human database about every little detail about these children and families. And if a crossing guard, right, can make that impact in 5 to 10 seconds of interaction day in and day out, can you imagine? Can you just imagine what people could do across this whole landscape of learning and development, for children and for families and for teachers? So anyway, I'll stop there. But
well, I love that we're talking about relationships, and you've both brought it up in beautiful ways. And that's the interesting thing about the learning sciences. As we read the learning sciences today and some of the things that that is just coming out so clearly, in many ways it doesn't sound terribly scientific, and it often sounds like a script from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right? About the core role of people, as you've just described in this example of the crossing guards, and Jane, as you talked about in the context of investing in people. So let me share a very concrete idea. As we look ahead in our high schools, in our museums, and our other sites of learning. So you all know that last year, Remake Learning pulled together what we called a Commission on the Future of Learning, and said, what is it that we want and need for our children and youth on the other side of this pandemic? And very early on, we focused on 3 frameworks: justice, methods, and relationships. And so in the context of relationships, we tried to really push ourselves to say, what are some ideas that we want to bring into the world that really aren't typical or might not even be? And one of those is, what if schools, could be an individual high school, could be a school district, what if we had directors of relationships? Now, directors of instructional innovation, as a comparable example, were unknown in school districts for the most part 10 years ago. Now they're fairly common. And I recognize that schools have counselors, and some private schools and some public schools maybe have something like a director of relationships. But what if it was just normal for school buildings to have not a counselor, we need counselors, and not teachers and crossing guards because we need them with important relationships, but someone whose square job is to figure out how am I going to help every single child in the school, especially those who don't have opportunities, build out all of their social capital, their networks, their relationships. And we invest in people to support other people in that way and to build their connections. That's something we can do. That's very Fred-like in supporting the type of learning that we need for our kids and giving them that grounding to know that they have something worth giving and sharing.
Jane, I know you also, mentioned a couple of times, even in designing these experiences in museums, where you're intentionally thinking about, when children come into these spaces, what are the people experiences that they're having in that space, with museum educators, with other children, as well as with the families that accompany them, right? And so much of, I think, your investment has been in investing in supporting the adults so that they can support children.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I always think that the Children's Museum is probably a misnomer, children part of it, but we like to honor children too, because everybody comes to the museum, right? And everybody's a learner, and we want to get that across. Like, everybody is still learning, and being together. I don't know. I think it's just important. We do that through our design. We actually design everything in-house, and then we prototype it. And our learning scientists actually look at what's happening, and then we kind of refine and re-refine so that we can get the conversations going. And we actually are opening a new exhibit when we reopen June 12th. Knocking on wood, yay! And it's an exhibit on kindness, and we're doing. We actually worked with Pixar, and we're opening an exhibit called Emotions at Play. That's based on the Inside Out movie, but it's kind of backwards from the way you might think you develop exhibits. We actually develop the experiences first, and then layer on the learning objectives. Because coming from the exhibit side of the business, you realize that if the experience isn't rich, you're not going to get to the learning objective. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting way of working with learning scientists to kind of see what's happening. And then we actually have principles of practice for each of our exhibits that we kind of use as a guide for our museum floor staff to really kind of enrich and create new experiences within the exhibits that we build. So it's a little bit different than going to a traditional museum where you walk through the galleries. This is we want everybody to feel welcome. In fact, my favorite compliment I ever got was from this woman, and Greg has probably heard, and you probably heard this story, but you know, I kept seeing this woman in our museum, and I finally went over and I said, I see her all the time, you know? And she's like, yeah, I love this place. I don't have kids. Is it okay I'm here? And I'm like, sure, like, of course. And she was like, I don't know, you guys just have great karma. I was like, okay, I'll take great karma. Like, if we can create great karma for kids and adults to learn together and to feel comfortable that they can kick off their shoes and learn something, then I think that kind of translates to the rest of life. You know, like, oh, we had a great time at the Children's Museum. We did this, like, let's do something, like, let's try this. Let's jump outside and jump on a couple of stones and go through the water fountain, and, you know, like, let's do things together and learn together. So,
you know, Jane, Fred Rogers talked about creating an atmosphere of great and joyful learning. That's what you've done. You've created an atmosphere.
Thanks. We like it, and we cannot wait to open up that joyful atmosphere again, because it's been a long, long year. But yeah, but we've used it to good measure, I would say. We've actually reimagined the Children's Museum, and, you know, we refer to Fred and Fred's teachings often, to the point where some people like go, stop, it's enough.
Well, but I think part of what is so exciting, right, about a creative and design experience that ultimately creates experiences and places that supports children's learning and development is there's so much intention and discipline that's behind it. So that, you know, and often these kind of processes or methods behind it are hidden, right? They're in the design rooms or in the studio in which, you know, when they produce Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So, Greg, I want to turn to you, because you and your co-author Ryan have, you know, you just released the book When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. And I know you don't have time to go through the whole book, and I know you've thought a lot about Fred's work. I just wonder, like, in the process of putting together the book, was there something about kind of these behind-the-scenes lessons that jumped out at you, surprised you, and give you an aha that you didn't even anticipate, you know, when you got into the process of kind of developing this book?
Many ahas. And the first aha begins with seeing Fred differently as an adult. It's not unlike, Junlei, your experience as a student of the learning sciences at Carnegie Mellon University, watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. For me as a grown-up, understanding his work differently, not merely as that warm, comfortable place, but as seeing Fred as a learning scientist. So that aha moment of seeing Fred as a learning scientist is in part the trigger for me and Ryan Rydzeski in pursuing this opportunity to tell this story about Fred Rogers' blueprints. Another aha, as you dig into the work, and I know you've done it so deeply in your own work and with the archives at Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent College, is really understanding how intentional and deliberate Fred Rogers was, and how attentive he was to the scripts, the guests, the design, everything about that episode, and how closely he worked with psychologists and learning scientists like Margaret McFarland to get it just right and to be responsive to the responsibility that he witnessed in his experience with each and every child that might be watching the program. And the third aha to your comment is how seamless it was. right? I think that's partly why it's only now as we become smarter about the learning scientists that we can see in Fred Rogers his work as a learning scientist. And let's just take you back to the program. So many of us had the joy of watching the show. Think of that beginning. Rapid jazz type of music that enters us in. We enter in from the outside, the frenzy of the world. Fred Rogers walks into that comfortable living room, and the music begins to slow down. He himself he slows down. There's a routine. There's a welcoming. There's a sense that you belong here. Welcome. Leave the energy outside. Start to slow down. We're going to start to notice. You're going to have all sorts of questions. Even the blue color on the walls, right? There was so much about what it is that he constructed in that environment, and really understanding how much environment drives behavior, in addition to the close attention to the scripts and the music. It was that aha of how intentional and how deliberate he was about what it is that he crafted that made it so magical. And there's, and so what we try and do in the book is elucidate a modern interpretation of those learning sciences, what we now know in 2021 about learning itself, how we can see it in something as familiar as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and then how and why that matters in our lives and our learning today. And as Jane says, not just in those sites of learning, but also in a crosswalk, in our own homes, and how we can make that accessible. And that's the other aha, is how accessible Fred Rogers made his blueprints for learning, and why that's so important to us now.
Yeah, I want to really emphasize this notion of how deliberate Fred was. I mean, and his staff, and continues, but especially when Fred was working with his staff. When we were doing, I'll just tell a quick story. When we were doing the Welcome to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, we were in the final throes of designing the exhibit and getting the words. Now, words in children's museums, signs in children's museums, most people don't pay that much attention to them because they're dealing with their kids and kids are not reading the signs. I remember standing in my office upstairs, and I was working with Kathy Droves, who's she still is a wonderful person who worked with Fred, and she was I was ready to send the graphics to the graphic designer that had to be there, and she and Fred were arguing about two words that no one was going to read. And I remember saying, and it's the only time I ever lost patience with them. I was like, I don't care what it is. Just tell me what the word is right now, because I changed this word back and forth 5 times. But the thing that actually I learned from that is that it was so important that we get it right. And so maybe the graphics were going to be late. And I think that's also why we started to prototype things, because it is important when you're working with children that the words are the right words. And to this day, I'm always, every time I say kids, I think, oh, Fred would just be so disappointed in me, because he really didn't like the word kids. It was always about children. So this deliberateness and this kind of care, I think people don't understand how difficult that was and how many people were involved in making sure that we got it right. So I'm glad that you really wrote about that in the book too, because the other part about Fred, it's all about the time, taking the time to make sure you get it right for kids, because they actually do deserve it. And we all deserve it. We all deserve thoughtfulness when we are presenting things to other people. So, yeah.
I wanted to take a question that's coming in from the audience before I turn to kind of wrapping up our conversation. The question is, I love the idea of supporting social emotional learning through the museums. I'm wondering how a designer utilizes tangible experiences to deliver such intangible content, and I'll broaden it a little bit. I think this is to both of you who've thought a lot about this from different angles. Fred often talked about the invisible essentials, right? There were so many things that he thought were just so essential to life, to development, but that's invisible kind of on the surface. So much of his work, Jane, what you just talked about, is him trying to take the invisible essentials and make it real, right? At least in a television program. But, as you think about museum, Jane, as Greg, as you think about the educational landscape and all the, people and places you've encountered, how do we answer the question? Like, how do we take the invisible essentials but make it tangible in the actual educational and learning experiences that children and families gets to have?
I think it's just by asking the burning questions about life that kids have. I mean, we did an exhibit on love and forgiveness that Greg was kind of involved in. It's my favorite exhibit that we ever did. And we created experiences where people could come together to have conversations. Again, another great story where I was like, okay, now I can retire, was that a father stopped me coming out of the love and forgiveness exhibit and said, "You're the director." I'm like, "Yeah." And he said, "I've got to tell you, I tell my kids I love them. I could tell my son I love him, 100 times a day, but this is the first time we ever really talked about what that meant." And so by creating spaces that can actually just have everybody slow down and have a conversation, I think it's really important. I know that in the chat here it says, well, how do you do some of that? In the Love and Forgiveness exhibit, which I never thought this would work, but we asked people to write something that really bugged them, that maybe they needed to forgive someone else about, or that was making them feel sad that day. And they wrote it down on a piece of paper, and then they actually ground it through a paper shredder, like you actually did it. And we prototyped this exhibit, and I'm like, it's like such a waste of paper. Actually, it ended up being like a really good release. In fact, there were days that I was like, I'm going down to the paper shredder. You write it down, and you put it through. And it's kind of fascinating that some things that are so simple, it's just by articulating, what your emotion at the time, articulating it, and then trying to let it go. That I think there are ways to just kind of create these spaces and these activities for social and emotional learning, just to be able to set the stage for the conversations that can happen later. So I don't know, I think every school should have a paper shredder thing. You actually have to go through, so kids who are having a bad day can release it and then do some yoga or something. I don't know. That's what I did.
So Junlei, I got to experience that exhibit on love and forgiveness as a dad with my wife and our two daughters, right? So one, it was unexpected coming into the Children's Museum to see such a big topic, big feelings, right? Yeah. Fred Rogers, acknowledge that kids have big feelings and they think about things in this world. Notice that. And I think about the exhibits in that space of, writing things down and putting it on the kindness tree, of shredding the paper, of the cooperative activities. And what I love about what Jane and her team did is, one, the prototyping that clearly went into the work, but then also just continuously noticing and asking museum goers, like, what is the experience? What's resonating with you? And I noticed the constant iterative work that Jane, you and your designers did in leading up to and during that exhibit. And that speaks to never stopping asking questions. And in the course of our book, Junlei, we try and identify very concrete things that people can do in their own classroom and their own homes. And one of them resonates with this exhibit because it makes me think of some work that Hedda Sharapin has done. Hedda Sharapin worked with Fred Rogers for decades, beginning on the first day of production. She's still working with productions and also the Fred Rogers Center. And she told us this story about having entered a classroom and noticing a teacher had a basket. and noticing that the teacher then used the basket when kids asked questions to pause, to turn attention away from whatever instruction was happening, however wild the question might be, and taking a moment to write it down. So noticing it, acknowledging it, and then saying, let's put this in the ask it basket. And then later, we're going to wonder aloud about this. Well, that's an incredibly joyful moment, a simple tactical thing that this teacher did in her classroom that could happen in a museum, could happen in my very own kitchen, that just contributes to that spark of social and emotional learning, discussion, exploration together, grown up, connected with the child.
Well, and I think grown-ups have to also be brave enough to have the conversations about love and forgiveness and death and, all of the things that kids and adults are really curious about that we don't talk about, and I think that I don't know, somehow as a society, we're not brave enough to talk about those things.
Well, and isn't that what Fred Rogers did so well?
That's right. That's right.
And
I think that's why everybody is turning towards Fred, because he was willing to talk about the tough things, like really the tough things.
Absolutely.
That are the most meaningful. It's just so fascinating to me.
There's a great moment in Morgan Neville's documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And Junlei, it's you. You're being interviewed and you comment about the very first week of programming that Fred Rogers invited war and subsequently invited assassination and divorce and other big topics.
Death. He did death.
Death. I mean, so he was so radical in the sense that he respected children to say, we're going to invite these big topics in. But as the actress Mary Rawson, who performed on the program, said, he invited those questions in, but he never allowed them to destroy the canvas. Right? So he invited hard questions in. Hard questions like we're wrestling with right now about inequities, about racism, about public health. He invited those questions in and said, we're going to talk about them, but we're not going to allow it to destroy joy either. And we're going to find a way to root ourselves in love and belonging and find answers together. And that's partly that legacy that's so important to us now too. I agree with you 1,000%, Jane.
So to take a cue, I think, from Fred, this is the last question that I'd love to hear from both of you before we wrap. A difficult topic. So, we talked quite a bit about being whole, right? Being, seamless. In part, the seamlessness of the museum experience as a learning experience, or Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, comes from the wholeness of how we see human beings, how we see our communities. And particularly over the last year, whether we are children or whether we're adults, we look around us, the world doesn't feel very whole. And I think, part of my understanding of kind of Fred thinking about the wholeness of human beings is that a human being is valued, right, for everything that they are. But if you look across, all the tragic reminders the last year, often human beings are just seen for one particular aspect of who they are, whether it is their skin color, or whether it's their sexual orientation, or whether it's their country of origin, or their refugee status, or whatever it may be, right? And that the world around us seem quite splintered, quite the opposite of wholeness. And so as we think about the challenging and the important work that comes next, right, not just go back to whatever that so-called normal was, but to actually build better communities and systems going forward, issues of racism, issues of equity, how do you see the connection between everything we've talked about so far to the enormous challenges that children and families and teachers and everyone faces going forward?
You saved this to last.
And I'm going to let you go first, Jane.
Oh, thanks. look, the thing that I think this whole person thing, I think that the thing that if there was one thing that I think is misunderstood about Fred is that the notion of you are special kind of didn't get the other part of it. And everybody else is special too. And that we are all in this together. Like everybody is unique and wonderful, and you should celebrate that. And it has been, I mean, this year, actually, past, I would say, I don't know, past year just kind of brought it to a head of the divisions and a little bit more focus on self rather than self within a family structure, a community, a world structure. I don't know. It's generally, I mean, if we figured that out, it would be, I think we just have to keep trying. In our own unique way of kind of really celebrating the child and at the same time kind of, wrapping the community around. I always think that if we just do the thing that Fred always says, put children first, we would make better decisions. And we would make decisions that actually made sense, right? We would make better decisions about our environment. We would make better decisions about our politics. We would make better decisions about almost an education if we really just put the kid first. And somehow we never do that, or we do that rarely. And when we do it, we go, yay. But I don't know, it just seems to me like we get things backwards by not putting kids first.
I think it starts with love, right? It starts with love, which in and of itself is a hard proposition. And the late and absolutely wonderful Joanne Rogers, who wrote in the foreword to our book, Junlei, she commented that no one practiced being Fred Rogers harder than did Fred Rogers, right? And so it goes back to the deliberate and intentional approach to really rooting himself in love. So, and then I think about Fred Rogers' admonition that, love really begins with listening. And this is, on both of these things, I fall short all of the time, right? I'm always quick. Oh, I've got the answer. I've got a solution. Oh, I've got an idea. And his reminder to us that the greatest gift that we can give to others is to genuinely listen. And especially now, with so much strife, with so much division, with so much hatred, really summoning love and then genuinely listening with love. And we have to practice that behavior. And it's a behavior that we can teach. And I feel like that's one of the great challenges of our times for us personally and as communities.
And I'm so glad you mentioned Joanne, because I always think of Joanne was like, if Fred were the moon and the sun, Joanne was the water and the earth. She was so visible in her love. Like, you walked into a room and Joanne would hug you and tell you how much she loved you. You didn't leave a room without her talking about how much.
And she'd make you laugh.
Huh?
She'd make you laugh.
And she'd make you laugh. And she was like, Fred was always up here. Joanne made it real.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we forget that too. Like, they were a dynamic duo in a lot of ways. So yeah, Fred practiced it, but not in the same joyful way that Joanne did. So I'm really glad we said that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Mrs. Joanne Rogers. We lost her earlier this year, but we also had an opportunity to remember and celebrate her life. And whereas Fred always seemed larger than life, I think all of us have our personal encounters with Joanne. And I think, obviously today we just begin to touch upon all these questions, and the much more important, difficult work lies ahead. I wanted to share, this one anecdote with Joanne that comes up over and over again in my memory. I don't even remember what it was, but I was visiting with her and I was asking her, what did you think Fred would have wanted, about a particular part of our own work? And she just stopped and looked at me and she said, that's not the important question. What would you like to do? And I think in a way, that is a question for all of us, right? Fred's legacy is there, it's documented, and thanks, Greg, to your wonderful book. But the important question that lies ahead is, what lessons do we draw and how do we choose to apply it, whatever our professional and personal roles are in our communities and neighborhoods.
Yes.
So with that, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jane, for joining me. And we want to thank Schools That Can for hosting this event. And I look forward to seeing you all in person very soon.
Great. Thank you so much, Junlei. This was fun.
It really was. It's great to be with Fred.
Listened in.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.